Good morning and a very warm welcome from Cape Town in South Africa. With me today I have both Professor John Thwaites. He is the former Minister of Victoria, um, and also Dr. Anthony Turton. Now, the reason why we are excited about this interview this morning is Professor Thwaites. Let's see if we can get back online. I think we are back online. Yes. And the reason why we wanted to invite you this morning, gentlemen, welcome both Dr. Anthony Turton and welcome Professor Thwaites. The reason why we wanted to have you online today is because there are so many similarities between Cape Town, South Africa, and our two countries. Could we start off the conversation by asking you why it's important that we find out firsthand what the Australian experience has been with the drought?
Yes, Brigitte, good morning to you and all of the listeners. Term planning cycle, and they were trying to reflect back on the past to figure out what lessons have been learned and how to continue managing water resources in an environment that is almost identical to the Western Cape. Winter rainfall area, very, very similar crisis to the day zero crisis that we've just been through. The only difference being that the city of Cape Town, that's embedded in the same broader hydrological environment, and yet got a very different trajectory. And the other thing that struck me was the fact that in South Africa, there's a narrative being put out there and perpetuated by people who I don't know what their agenda is about that period of time, which is very significant in South Africa at the moment. It's number one, the amount of effort that was put into the conversation by these top-ranking water sector professionals in how to improve services to customers. What do customers think about the water service delivery? But more important in this is very, very important. Finally, there was another thing that completely blew me away when I was in Melbourne, where now we have a situation where a city that's gone onto desalination for base flow has now made a conscious decision that it can use that water that's not used in the dam to an incredibly positive economic trajectory. It's a shining example of resilience and how to decouple an economy from the vagaries of nature in a very, very uncertain climatic world. So I think there are many lessons to be learned, and it was for that reason that I was very anxious that we should have.
Well, thanks, Brigitte, and good morning. We certainly faced a very serious drought from the period 1998 through to 2010, so about 12 to 13 year period of drought. But even within the drought period, there was significant variation, and we had a 75% reduction in our normal rainfall. The key lesson that I think we learnt from that period is that you need to have a diverse set of sources of water supply. You can't just rely on rainfall. In confidence, a decline in business confidence, and that undermines the whole economy. So we learned in that period that we needed to have other sources of water, and that's what led us to build a very large desalination plant, 150 billion litres of water available per year, up to that amount, but also to look at other sources of water like stormwater harvesting and recycled water or anything else. Diversity gives you resilience.
What now? Desalination in South Africa is being touted as being too expensive, and you initially started with 2 permanent desalination plants. What made you decide?
Western Australia has now built 2 plants, and there are plants in Queensland and New South Wales. And in Western Australia, frankly, they would have run out of water many years ago if they didn't have a desalination plant for Perth. It's absolutely required. Interestingly, it became polluted with the floods, and they were able to use a desalination plant in a flood circumstance. So I think that's another example of the importance of diversity. But in Victoria and in Melbourne, we've got a substantial desalination plant which is available for Melbourne. But we've also, as for its cost, it is expensive. There's no getting away from the cost of desalination. It's more expensive than rainfall into an existing dam. It's not a lot more expensive than if you have to build a whole new dam, or if you have to build, for example, a major new recycling centre. But you have to compare. In Melbourne, we're not only faced with the challenge of climate change and less water, we've also got huge population growth. So Melbourne is now growing at the rate of about 1 million people in 8 years, in less than a decade. We're now servicing 50% more of the reservoirs.
Anthony, if I can bring you in here, is that possibly where we have a major dissimilarity? What I'm hearing from John is he's talking about taking into account the population explosion or population growth, and they're also taking into account
narrative. The Australians have got it right because they understand water as an economic enabler. And they therefore understand that if you can bring water to a region, then you can create a whole lot of other benefits that flow from that water. There's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation. And the first time I ever saw that, related issues, cathodic protection issues on that particular pipeline. So he took me for a tour from the start to the finish of that pipeline. And all the way along that pipeline into the desert, you actually see development taking place. And you've now had more than a century of development that has been enabled by what was originally seen as almost a madman's version of how to get that. In South Africa, we have a very high level of ideological discourse. And the ideological discourse is absent in Australia. In Australia, the technical people are just technical people and they get on with doing their job. In South Africa, we are all embedded in big ideological bun fight. And in this ideological space, capital is seen to be a problem. Now, we don't talk about being engaged with the presidency of this country. Just this week, I've received an invitation to participate in a high-level panel. I've been calling on the presidency to establish a non-partisan technical task team to look at this whole water problem in South Africa, to understand water as an economic enabler, and to do this in a non-partisan. Water is an economic enabler on the one hand, and water is managed as a flux, enables you to become an economic enabler. So the recycling of water, the building up of a portfolio of options, the building up of resilience by decoupling your economy from the vagaries of nature, by having a multitude of sources, loss of investor confidence, 500,000 people unemployed, and no job growth prospects for the next decade. Compare that to Melbourne. When you walk down the streets of Melbourne, wherever you look, there's a construction site working. There are people busy building high-rise buildings. It is an absolute booming economy. And this having come this whole process with Cape Town, I recommended to the city of Cape Town that they should actually form a partnership with Perth and with Melbourne, because these are two cities that have got very similar problems. And in fact, the consulting engineers to the cities were similar. They had international collaboration because they were part of a multinational company to transfer these ideas. So these ideas are
desalination, or the Australian government has told South Africa that desalination is too expensive and that you made a mistake in investing in desalination. Is that true?
Well, I'm sorry, plant, we couldn't have the development that we've got. And I've had developers, builders, construction people come to me and say, thank goodness that you did that, because without that, we couldn't build these new suburbs. We just wouldn't have the confidence. Having said all of that, like everything in it rains, people say, oh, see, we didn't need it. But the problem with that is that if it stops raining, which it did, you can't build a desalination plant overnight. If you're going to run out of water, you have to be planning for that well in advance and putting in. But thank goodness we know now we've got enough water for the future. And business is certainly saying that as well. The other point I'd make is that at the time we built the desalination plant, interest rates were much higher because it was right at the time of the global financial crisis. Running out of water and loss of business confidence, then the cost seems relatively minor and very worth investing in. And the other thing I'd have to say is we met with people from the Cape Town province and government officials because there is a concern about the future. And just because it's rained, 1 year doesn't mean it's going to rain next year. And I think around the world,
in planning for your water infrastructure. In Cape Town, for example, we faced with having to carry buckets of water. We tell our tourists that they can't come and have a bath, that they can only have a 2-minute shower. I with recycled water in a bucket. How important was the user experience for you in deciding on building water resilience?
well, obviously the user experience is fundamental. And as Anthony said, everything we do is driven by what the consumer to reduce water use very substantially, and we reduced it by more than 40% per head. Now, that didn't get to the crisis levels that you went, where I think you were down to 55 litres a person per day. But it was a substantial task, and I know, my parents, I had elderly parents. You wouldn't want to do that forever. So I think what we want to do is maintain the value of water. We certainly don't want to go back to water wasting, and we have a high priority on water efficiency. But by the same token, with climate change and the uncertainty of rainfall, we've got to have some alternative source of water.
Circumstances and where you are today, I'd like to lead you with a couple of questions, if I might, please. Okay. The first question is, as a former minister, as the chairman of Vic Water, now Melbourne Water, do you consider climate change to be a real factor?
Well, absolutely. And all the advice, the expert advice, is that climate change is impacting on our water supply now. If you look at the amount of water in 20th century average, now in Perth, the reduction is far more than that. And our major scientific organisation, the CSIRO, has done research on the impact of climate change on our water supply. And I think it's fair to say that the impact of climate change varies in different parts of the country. It's not nearly so clear in the north of the country, for example, in Queensland, that climate change is less runoff into the dams. And it appears to be that that reduction in runoff is a critical factor that we're facing as well.
Okay, then that leads me to the next question, if I might, then, because my understanding is that you've done a very sophisticated analysis of the dam as that is brought onto the balance sheet. So even though the water's in the dam, but not yet in economic use, it has value, and that value is directly attributed to the net benefit of having desalination, which has caused the water not to be drawn down in the first place. Can you just walk us through that convoluted process, please? How the logic...
And we have had modelling done by senior researchers through the University of Melbourne, which has indicated that there is actually a value in having the dams full, and that is more than 60% full and not falling below that level. And the reason for that is when you model all of that new augmentation. So what you don't want is to have to keep building new desal plants. If you build one, you want to use it, essentially. And so that's why we now have developed a policy of putting desal water in as base load, not waiting for economic value, which goes to things like business confidence, ability to attract development, tourism, reputation for Melbourne, and also, as you indicate, to improve the environment, because by having that water, it means we can guarantee environmental flows to the rivers and also water for our parks and gardens and sporting fields. Now, Melbourne prides itself on being one of the most livable cities in the world, and we were the #1, and we've just been pipped at the post by Vienna, and we're now number 2. But that livability is very much part of our ability to market ourselves, not just for tourists, but for businesses to come here. So water is a key to life, it's a key to business, and having enough water that we don't risk running out is a key to that economic success.
Okay, so that's fantastic. If I can just continue. So, in your broader understanding of water as an enabler, am I correct in that assumption?
It is, but it's only early days for the economic valuation of those environmental benefits, and that's something that Melbourne Water is working on together with the Victorian government and the other Melbourne Water retailers. And we're increasingly looking at this as how do we deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. So it goes beyond just water. The well-educated, happy community relies not just on a certainty about water, but also having the ability to have the sporting fields watered, having the ability to have parks that are healthy and have enough water. So we're increasingly using the Sustainable Development Goals as our benchmark.
There's a meme put out in South Africa by the denialists that when you desalinate, you create toxic brine, and I use toxic in inverted commas, and you now cause all sorts of damage to the ocean ecosystems. So in your experience now with quite a substantial desalination plant, is this brine toxic, and does it have a defined ecological impact, or can this be managed in the design? And
very extensive environmental analysis done, which was a public process where all of these issues were aired, where people's views could be put, and so that I think put extra pressure and certainty on the process to ensure that it was environmentally rigorous. And I'd certainly be recommending, if consideration has been given in South Africa, to, and as I said, let's look at the net environmental benefit. The fact that we have a certain supply of water means we can keep providing environmental flows for the rivers. Now, 30, 40 years ago when we had a drought, we basically drained the river, and that had enormously negative environmental.
That's very significant what you've said there now. This whole public participation is a very, very important part, obviously, of any sustainable development and any attempt by any legitimate government to provide goods and services to its people, and particularly to meet their reasonable aspirations about the quality, where they are taking 120 megalitres a day of sewage that they used to dump offshore in a pipeline, much like Cape Town does, much like Durban used to do, and they are recycling that water. They are recovering the water to the highest possible quality of potable standards, and they're storing it. Your comments, please, on the recycling of sewage.
So we're not looking at sewage for potable reuse. That's for drinking. We're certainly using recycled water in fit-for-purpose applications, including toilet flushing or garden use, but we're not looking at it for potable reuse. We're also looking very seriously at stormwater harvesting and want to significantly boost stormwater harvesting, once again, for non-potable use, where I think it's fair to say we're better off focusing on using the desal plant and on stormwater harvesting and on continuing to be very efficient in our water use. The challenge with potable reuse is you immediately buy into an enormous political fight, and I think encourage people to accept potable reuse is to store it in an aquifer for many years, which is what they're doing in Perth. And after that period, I think that there'll be much greater acceptance for using it.
But okay, just in closing then, the storage of water that's being produced, even in times of abundance, is still a factor that should be cost-benefit equation. Am I right or wrong in that assumption? Then I'll hand over to Brigitte.
No, you're absolutely right, and that is what we're seeking to do, to store it in the dams to make sure that we don't let the dams go down to a low level and then try to recover in a drought, but understand politics and politicians will often take a short-term view, which is based on what's today's cost, but to risk the future, to risk the potential to run out of water, I just don't think it's something that you can do as a politician that's looking after the long-term interests of the community that you're serving.
Your water resilience by not allowing your dams to drop below a certain level. And so what I'm getting from that is that you have rather chosen to be proactive instead of reactive. I think in Cape Town the experience was pretty much let's wait and see what happens. Let's hope for rain, by being proactive instead of reactive.
Well, I think it's been a positive outcome because it's enabled Melbourne to have this amazing growth and economic success. We're attracting international students to Melbourne. In fact, education is our biggest export market. People want to come here to live. We're attracting migrants. We are a migrant country. Nearly half of Australians were either born overseas or had a parent born overseas, and supply of water.
Thank you very much. I think the one big lesson or take home for me is that we need to realize that water unlocks everything. And that's possibly where we are going wrong. We don't understand the importance of water. We can learn from that everything else stems from water security, and that we need to be proactive and not reactive. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I think this was a very fruitful conversation for us to have, and that there are many, many lessons that we can.
That part of the world, I always come back from Australia being completely blown away by the future thinking and just the systematic, steady way, the responsible way that technical people manage water. So thank you very, very much. I was up in Queensland a year ago on the Burdekin River. They've also got somewhat of a crisis that is being articulated by visionary leadership based on rock-solid science, engineering, and technology. So that's the important thing. It's a future projection of economic stability, of aspirations that are reasonable and that can be met. That's the first thing. The second thing I would like to say is that South Africa has now apparently started to bear fruit. I've just received an invitation to participate with the minister in some task team work, just to try and unravel what we're talking about today. And I'm going to bring the message, a whole podcast today. I'm going to take with me, directly give it to the minister and say, this is an example of which economic future. Thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I wish you very, very well in your endeavours. But I've got absolutely no doubt that you are not going to survive. You're going to continue to thrive.
Gentlemen.
Well, thank you, and I certainly hope so. And if I could just finally say that I know that we've got some your water people from South Africa and share information, knowledge and expertise.
That's very heartwarming. Thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you for sharing your experience, and thank you for saying that you are willing to work with us in South Africa. We appreciate it. Goodbye for now.